The last lecture was on kanji. This lecture is on kana. So I'm going to start way back in the beginning of Japanese history and move all the way into the 20th century. So strap on your seatbelts. Here we go. The story of kana begins with something called Manyogana. Some of the first written Japanese, not classical Chinese, I want you to keep those separate in your brain, is found in the poetry anthology called the Manyoshu, the collection of myriad leaves. If you've studied any classical Japanese literature, you've probably had exposure to some poems from the Manyoshu. The Manyoshu, by the way, dates back to early Japanese history. It's a collection of poems across a number of centuries from about the 5th or 6th century into the 7th or 8th. The Manyoshu, as a text, was an experiment. It was written before the Japanese had established their own writing system, and they were playing around with possibilities. So it was an experiment that involved a mix of using characters for their phonetic value and for also their semantic value. In other words, what they mean, not just how they sound, but what they mean. And this all took place before kana existed. So it really is the crucible of the written language. And Manyogana, which I'm going to show you some examples of, I tell you, it makes modern Japanese look easy. So here's an example from the Manyoshu. The Manyoshu has over 4,000 poems. This is poem number 17 out of the huge collection. And what I've provided you with is, on the top, the way that the poem was written when the anthology was put together. The next line is essentially how to read the poem out loud, if you were to do so, using katakana. And the next line is how the poem is rendered into not modern Japanese as a grammatical language, but modern Japanese as a written language. I'm going to be saying more about classical Japanese in a subsequent lecture. But if we were going to write this poem on the page today, using kanji and kana the way that we're familiar with, that's what it would look like, that third line. And then the last line gives us the romanized version of the poem, and at the bottom I've given you a translation. From the Shio road across the mountains to the morning calm of the sea at Hakuhi, I wish I had a boat. Okay, so that top line is pretty wacky. Just looking at it, solid kanji, what's going on there? I'll tell you, mere mortals, they can't read this stuff. I can't read this stuff. I have to have it glossed. The sounds here that I have made red, the kanji that I have made red, are written with multiple characters. What do I mean by that? Well, mo, here's mo over here. That character, that's haha, or mother, right? But in this context, it's read mo. See it down here? Mo. This one's also read mo, however. So what I mean by multiple characters is it's not as if there was a static set, a really small static set of kanji, one for each syllable that exists in Japanese. Think about the Goju Onzu, and we have one kanji corresponding to one of the characters in the Goju Onzu. That's not the way it was. There were multiple kanji being used for what, at least today, we think of as the same sound. It's perfectly possible that, and linguists theorize, that Japanese early on had more sounds than it does today in modern Japanese, but let's not get into too deep of the linguistic weeds there. Let's stick just with the Manyogana. So the sounds, the first thing I want to point out is that the sounds are written with multiple characters, okay? Or can be written with multiple characters. But the other thing I want to point out is that While all the particles and most of the words are represented phonetically. So, for example, this is ta da. That character is read ta. This one's read da. These kanji are just being used like ateji for their sound, not for their meaning. Most of the words in Manyogana, in the Manyoshu, are being used like this. But there are a few that are used for their semantic value. So in this particular poem, for example, we have umi, sea, and funekaji, or. These are being used for their semantic value in this particular poem. So the Manyoshu poetry has this maddening mix of kanji that are being used for their phonetic value and a few kanji that are being used for their semantic value. And back in the day of the Manyoshu, that didn't have the advantage of multicolor printing or anything like that. So if you were looking at a text, you would be looking at something that didn't distinguish between the semantically used kanji and the phonetically used kanji. Now you can see why I say that mere mortals don't read this stuff. It's really hard, okay? And it even gets more complicated. That's why I said you had to strap on your seatbelts. Okay, so here is a partial chart of characters that were used in the Manyoshu for their phonetic value. So these are Manyogana. This is a partial chart of Manyogana, and it's divided up by vowels and consonants. As you can probably guess, we got the consonants across the top. Think of this kind of like a modified Goju Unzu kind of chart. And then we got the vowels down the left-hand side. Why are there sub 1 and sub 2? Because, as I was saying, linguists think that early on Japanese had a greater sound set than it has today. So instead of just one kind of vowel that we represent with an I, there were actually two. We don't know what that sounded like. We can make some linguistic guesses, but again, let's not get into those weeds just yet. Okay, so look at this chart. This is huge. There's an awful lot of stuff going on here. We've got tons of characters, for example, that in theory could be pronounced shi. Look at all of those. This was not a really good writing system. I'm sure you figured that part out already. But I'm mentioning all this so that you can understand what happens later on with Kana. All right, so the Manyogana system was untenable. It was hard to read even for people of the time. It didn't last long. Very quickly people realized that they needed something else. So in theory, Kana develops from Manyogana, in theory. That's a simple theory, and I'm kind of going to go with it for just a moment here, and then I'll double back. Here's what that chart of the development of Kana looks like. And you can find a similar chart in the appendices of your Nelson's dictionary. If you just look at this chart, you might be under the impression that the Manyogana set was small. Like I was saying earlier, that there was one Manyogana for every modern sound, only one, not a dozen, not 2 dozen, just one, and here it is real straightforward. We know that's not the case. But to make things simpler, particularly for children, and I got this chart out of a children's dictionary, we'll first look at this development, okay? So across the top here, in the dark red, are the Manyogana, some, of course, not all, but some of the Manyogana. The middle line, that's kind of pink, shows us the cursive script of those kana. And then the white line shows us, I'm hoping you're familiar with this, the modern kana that Manyogana became. So the simple take on this is that kana develops from Manyogana. It doesn't just come out of thin air. It really is representative of originally some kanji. So in this chart we can see the hiragana on the top, and we see the development of katakana on the bottom. Would that it were so simple. We know it wasn't, though. life is not so neat and clean. A real chart of the development of Kana looks something like this. This is partial. I couldn't fit the whole thing on a screen. You'd have to use a magnifying glass, so I'm just giving you a partial list here. So here we see the expanded version, if you will. It's still not totally complete, but it is much more than what we saw in that previous chart. Of different kanji here, for example at the top, different manyogana that were used to represent the sound ah, and then below each one, variants of how those manyogana appear or have appeared or can appear if they're written with or in grass script. At this point you're thinking, okay, right, like, why do I need to know this? What's the point? Just sit tight. We'll get there, okay? So keep this in mind that there were multiple possible ways to write kana. Not just this thing that we're really familiar with, right? But lots of different ways in which kana might appear, particularly in a handwritten text, but not just handwritten, as we'll see. So I'm going to fast forward a few centuries. That last chart we were looking at covers a good stretch of time in Japanese history, all the way up, frankly, to into the Tokugawa period and beyond. I'm going to just try and make a long story short. Eventually, a smaller set of kana were unofficially settled upon, and the current system of mixing kanji and kana solidified, and we have what we have today, right? But I don't want to leave behind what we were just looking at, that previous chart. That previous chart gives us a lot of different possibilities. And the reason why it's important is that there's sort of a transition point. So that's why I say in my bullet point, it's not what you're used to, at least not yet. There were, and I'm now talking about the Meiji period for the most part, alternative kana that were still standardized. And those are known as hentai kana. Hen means different, changed. Okay, so they're kana that have a changed body or a changed appearance. Here's a chart of those alternative forms of kana or hentai kana. Now, what I want to point out about this chart, beyond the fact that you may think, well, this is just sort of an abbreviated version of that earlier chart we were looking at, which in a way it sort of is. But here's the thing I really want to point out about this chart. It's typeset. It is not handwritten. It is typeset. That means that these alternative forms of kana are things that you will find, and indeed I certainly have found often, in printed texts from the Meiji period. So we're not just looking at somebody's handwriting, something squiggly or whatever, okay? We're looking here at versions of kana that really do appear in printed text, texts that were printed with movable type. This chart, by the way, comes from the inside of the Rose Inn's Kanji Dictionary, which is kind of an artifact now. The U Albany Library does have a copy of it if you want to go check it out. It's in the reference section. But it's kind of a difficult chart to find. I've never seen anybody else quite list it like this. I've seen plenty of charts of manyogana, as we were looking at just a little bit earlier, but I've never seen this particular chart anywhere else. So what it gives you, I just want to point out a couple of things real quick. Excuse me, real quickly, and then we'll look at another example. What it gives you is the current kana. In this case katakana, and then hiragana, and then it also gives you possible forms here that you might find in a text. Okay. And the other thing that it gives us, and this is really kind of wacky, is these things over here, koto. These are weird abbreviations. I don't know how you'd find those any other way. They're not in a Nelson's, they're not in a Kokugo Jiten. You can't find hentai gana in your IME pad. Uh, these are tricky. So I guess what I'm saying is don't forget you have access to this chart. Okay, let's move on. Here is a text that it was printed in the Meiji period. And what I've done is I have put a red square around, I think, most of the hentai gana that appear. So you'll see kana that's really familiar, but then you're also going to see kana that's kind of surprising. And in case you want help with that, here I've glossed. Actually, I'll tell you right now, I made a mistake. That zo should be a ga. That's my bad. But I've glossed those kana with the kana that you're more familiar with. Now, in a lot of cases, like in my case, I read these texts now, and usually I just figure out what the hentai gana is, either from memory or from context. But it's not just in these old texts that we see hentai gana. Let me show you an example. These are photographs of store signs, in this case restaurant signs, from modern day Japan. And each one of these signs uses some version of hentai gana. Having lived in Kyoto, I'll tell you that I do notice that quite often. Kyoto takes great pride in its historical base, and so store owners often choose hentai gana on their signs. Now, as a learner of Japanese, you probably walk by the sign and look at the hentai gana and think, well, that's just something I don't know. That's a kanji I don't know, or whatever. You know, you're kind of blind to it. But now that I've told you about hentai gana, maybe when you're walking down the street in Japan, you'll notice them a little more often. So what are these signs? Here they are. The one on the left is unagi. So that second character is a hentai gana. The one in the middle is otafuku. Now that ta, that kana, that hentai gana comes from the kanji ta as in multiple. So really there's sort of two ways to read that sign. You could take it as simply a cursive version of the ta, or you could take it as the hentai gana. And the one on the right is yabusoba. So the second and the fourth kana are hentai gana. So you can see in that previous slide also how hentai gana gets mixed in. It's not as if you're looking at a text where all the hentai gana is being used. It just gets mixed in, and it's artistic license on the part of the writer which one he or she is using. Kind of cool, isn't it? Okay, let's shift gears. We're still talking about kana. We've already looked at the development of kana. We know where kana came from. But kana has changed in other ways. So let's look at the modification of orthography. Orthography is a word some people feel a little uncomfortable with. Think of it as spelling. You might think that nowadays orthography is pretty straightforward. I mean, how tricky can that be? You learned your kana, you write your Japanese homework, life is easy, right? Of course, we write the sound cho with chi-yo-ru, and that's how we represent that sound. I mean, how else could we represent that sound? I can't even think of it. Well, that's just the way it is. Makes perfect sense to us, right? But I gotta tell you, it's not that easy. Before 1945, the way that kana was used to represent sounds was different from what you have learned in your Japanese class today. Not entirely, but I would argue significantly. That old spelling or that old orthography is called kyu kana zukai. All right, the kyu means old, so the old usage of kana. That orthography has some different kana, some that we're not using anymore today, and it also has some different representations of certain sounds. So here's the basic chart, and there's a little bit of sad overlap there. I'm sorry about it. But this chart you can also find in the appendix of your Nelson's, in one of the appendices of your Nelson's. So this is not the only place to find it. And you'll see that there are a number of sounds that were written quite differently from what you're used to. Some of these are intuitive, and some of them, frankly, just are not. I think my very favorite one is this one right here. Cho was not written Chiyou, it was written Te Fu. When you pronounce these, when you're reading a text out loud, you pronounce it Cho. So there's no difference in the sound, but there's a difference in the way the sound is represented. It is difference in the spelling, in other words. And one of the reasons why this was a fairly big change in the 20th century, or one of the reasons why it became easier, I suppose, is that whole idea of small kana, the small ya yu yo, the small tsu, that's all new. That all comes in with the new kanazakai. In the old kanazakai, you were only working with regular size, so to speak, kana. Incidentally, in the old kana, if you go far enough back, there is no indication of voiced consonants either. So you have to tell from context whether something was a ha or a ba or a pa. We're not going to worry about that today. So here we see that Q kanazakai. Look down here. Ooh, what's that? That looks different. That's a new friend. Well, remember when we were talking about the Goju Unzu? Here it is again. And I said we'd come back to these wacky things in the parentheses. Well, we're back there now. These are sounds that we think existed in Japanese long ago. They're in the Wagyo, so I suppose the guess is it's we and we, but we don't pronounce them that way. We haven't pronounced them that way for quite a long time. If you see these kana, you pronounce them e and e. In terms of how they're pronounced, they're no different than this, and they're no different than this. No different than this, and no different than this. But there was probably a difference back in the age of the Manyoshu. Okay, so let's say a little bit more about the Kyu Kanazakai. Here are a few bullet points of big changes that have happened in the Kyu Kanazakai. First of all, we have this kana that we don't use very often, or we don't see at all today, right? It's pronounced e, and it's written today with that sound. Let's go back and look at the Goju Unzu for just a second. Okay, there's that e, and as I said, it makes no difference. It sounds just like this. Okay. It's used primarily in the auxiliary verb iru, which denotes continuous action. For example, tabete iru would be written tabete iru. Okay. Today we would use this e instead. Here's that other kana. This one is pronounced e, and today we write it with this. It's used in a variety of words. This kana you're familiar with, but you know it only in the context of it being a particle that marks a direct object. In pre-war Japanese, prior to 1945, it can be used embedded in words. For example, this character, this kanji, would be glossed otoko. Let me emphasize, because I said it very quickly now twice, but I want to put a point on it, that the Kyu Kanazakai was used for everything that was written prior to 1945. If you pick up any text that was printed prior to 1945, it will use this system. And that's not that long ago. It's less than 100 years ago. That's why I think it's really important to become familiar with the Kyu Kanazakai. Not that you learn how to write with it, but that you learn how to read it. Because if you don't, you have no access to that history, to that relatively recent history. A couple more examples, and then I'll try and pull it all together for you. The Kyu Kanazakai also uses this kana, which is familiar, we use it today, but they use it in a different context. In a lot of contexts where today we would use this kana. I'll show you an example in a minute. Wa we know as a particle, but when we use it as a non-particle, we use this kana. But in the Kyu Kanazakai, when it's embedded in a word, this kana is usually pronounced wa, not ha. Hu is used for long vowels. Now we use this kana instead, but when it's embedded in a word, a lot of verbs use this. It's usually pronounced u and not fu. All right, as I was saying, this old use of kana was officially phased out about the same time as complex kanji were officially phased out in 1945, again, thanks to the end of World War II and the American occupation and all kinds of reforms. Books issued before 1945 and then reissued after 1945, however, will often have the newer forms. There'll be a note in the beginning of the book that says when this book was first published, it used the Kyu Kanazakai and the complex kanji, and now we have simplified it in the following ways. Couple more changes that happen with this switch in writing, and then I'll show you a total example. In older texts, we're talking up till 1945, writers tended to use more kanji than they use in newer texts. So when you look at one of these books that's been reprinted after 1945, often they will take the kanji and render it instead in kana. So in other words, writers today often opt for kana for many words when there's actually a perfectly good kanji that they could use. So let's bring it all together. We'll look at an example of these changes in one text. On the right-hand side is the modern version, and on the left-hand side is the pre-1945 version. This is actually a passage of an essay by Natsume Soseki, who died in 1915. He wrote this in 1911. It's about the poet Masao Kishiki. And what I've done is I've highlighted in red the different places where a change has taken place. So let's go through one by one. Here we have a simplified kanji for a complex kanji. A small tsu where in the original there was a large tsu. Again, same idea here with the tsu. This kanji, the i in the continuative verb, is written with this older kana. I'm sorry, I said kanji. This kana. Another small tsu has been modified, or a big tsu is modified into a small tsu. Here we have kanji shimatteru that's been switched into kana. It's not too often you see the kanji for shimatte, shimao, and actually those are ateji anyway. And here also the kanji has been switched into kana. Here's another simplified kanji, two more simplified kanjis. Kazu and tatsu. Another kanji that's been rendered into kana, and finally one more large tsu that's become a small tsu. It's the same text, and if we were reading it out loud, it would sound exactly the same. But you can see how the writing itself has changed over time. One more thing I got to throw in right now because this is really where it belongs. We're going to come back to the iroha when we're doing ordinal systems, but I want to point this out right now. What is the iroha? This is an ordinal arrangement. It's a poem, actually, has been used for centuries and was used for a long time before the linguists came up with that goju onzu paradigm that they love so much. So think of it as a separate way of organizing the sounds in Japanese, a separate ordering of the alphabet, if you will. The poem is based on a Buddhist poem, and the trick to this poem, it's not great poetry, but the trick to it is that it repeats each syllable in Japanese in the goju onzu only once. So it's representative of those 50 sounds. Okay. There are some voiced sounds in there, but they are automatically associated with the unvoiced column in the goju onzu. And the reason why I really want to mention the iroha right now is because we just got done looking at that Kyu Kanazakai, and I really think that the iroha doesn't make sense unless you're working in the old orthography. So here it is. This is also available in Nelson's. I scanned this from my Nelson's, so the formatting might be a little bit different than yours because I have the old Nelson's, not the new one. So this is the iroha arrangement. On the left-hand side, we have the poem itself. In the middle column, we have how it would be written in romanization. In other words, if you were reading it out loud, what would it sound like? And on the right-hand side is the kana that each of those syllables represents. Okay. So let's look at the first line. Iro wa nioi do. Iro wa nioi do. Okay. So I want to point out here we have an e. If I'm reading it, I say e. But it's representative of the kana he, because it's done in the old kana, okay, in the Q kanazukai. Likewise, here, this is read o, and it's read out loud here or it's written in the romanization o, but it is distinct from this o, the one that begins oku here, because that one would be written, see if you can tell with my highlighter, like that. Okay. So the Ito-ha, when you're told the Ito-ha represents each of the syllables, you got to remember that that really refers to the Goju Unzu and how this poem would have been written in the Kyu Kanazukai. So let me give you a quick summary of changes so far in the first and the second video, and then we'll move on to the third one. We've seen a standardization of the basic kanji set, thanks to the government. We've seen a standardization of simplified kanji forms. We've seen a standardization of the kana sets. And we've seen a standardization of orthography. There's a lot of moving parts here. The next thing that we're going to look at is linguistic modernization.